I don't know if I can ever go back into the woods again after what happened last November. I used to think of the forest as a quiet place, a place to escape the constant noise of people, phones, cars, and the rest of the world. But that trip to the cabin changed the way I look at silence. I learned that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it means someone's watching you, and you don't even know it yet. It started as a short solo trip, just 3 days in a cabin about 15 miles off any paved road. I'd been to that spot before with my cousin 2 years earlier. The cabin belonged to a retired ranger who now rented it out to people looking for real peace and quiet. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees, cold air, and stillness. I'd been feeling burnt out after a rough year. Work was stressful, and my sleep had been all over the place. I thought that being alone in the woods might help reset everything. I took Friday off and drove out Thursday morning. Took me 4 hours to get there. The last part was a bumpy drive along a narrow dirt trail, covered in fallen leaves and potholes. I had to slow to a crawl a few times because I didn't want to rip the bottom out of my car. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked exactly like I remembered. It was small and plain, just one room with a porch in front and a chimney in back. The wood siding was faded, and some of the logs were cracked, but it looked sturdy. Inside, it was simple but warm. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen area with an old propane stove and sink, a single bed in the corner, and a big wooden table in the center. I unpacked, started a fire, and boiled some instant coffee. There wasn't much else to do that first day, so I took a walk around the clearing. The forest was dense but beautiful. Cold air hung around the trees like mist. I could hear nothing but wind through the branches and the occasional caw of a distant bird. Felt good. My shoulders started to relax for the first time in weeks. That first night was quiet. I cooked canned soup, listened to the fire crackle, and wrote a little in my notebook. I didn't bother locking the door. The closest person was probably 20 miles away. I fell asleep with the sound of wind moving through the trees outside the windows. But the next morning, something felt different. I don't know why exactly, but I woke up with a strange weight in my chest. I remember sitting up in bed and staring out the window for a while. It wasn't even light out yet. There was a pale blue color to the sky, like it hadn't fully decided whether to be morning or night. I got up and went outside to use the outhouse, which was maybe 50 feet from the cabin. As I stepped off the porch, I noticed something strange on the ground. There were boot prints in the frost. Not mine. I'd worn thick-soled hiking boots, and these were different. Narrower, flatter, maybe work boots or sneakers. They led from the trees, circled around the back of the cabin, and stopped near the woodpile. I just stood there for a while, staring at them. My first thought was that maybe someone had been passing through. A hunter, maybe, but the tracks didn't lead away. They just ended at the woodpile, like whoever made them had stopped there and stood still for a long time. That made my skin crawl a little. I followed the prints back toward the edge of the woods, but they vanished under fallen leaves. I stood there in the cold, just staring into the trees, trying to listen for anything. But it was silent. I went back inside and locked the door. That was the first time I felt uneasy, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was probably just a hiker who wandered close. People do that sometimes without realizing they're near private property. Maybe they saw the cabin and left before I woke up. I spent most of that day indoors. I read an old paperback I brought with me, made some more coffee, and stayed near the stove. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw movement in the trees. Maybe it was just the wind, but a few times I could have sworn I saw something yellow through the branches, like the sleeve of a jacket. That second night was colder. I added extra wood to the stove and wrapped myself in a blanket. I tried to sleep early, but every creak of the wood frame made me open my eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, more like a scraping or shuffling sound. I stayed perfectly still in the bed. The fire had burned low, so the room was dim and the air colder. I listened carefully. The sound was near the porch. Slow, dragging footsteps. A heavy step, then a scrape, like someone walking with a limp. I didn't move for almost an hour. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, just watching the door. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside. There were more boot prints, the same kind as before, going back and forth in front of the porch. This time they were deeper, and I could see where the person had slipped a little on the frozen mud. They went around the side of the cabin and disappeared again into the woods. That morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I didn't have cell signal, so I couldn't call anyone. But I figured if I packed up fast, I could be back on the road by noon. I loaded my things into the car and went to check around the back of the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something hanging on a low branch about 10 feet from the porch. It was a strip of yellow cloth, like the edge of a rain jacket, caught in the bark. There were dark stains on it. Not blood exactly, but something greasy and brownish, like oil or grime. I didn't want to touch it. I turned and walked fast back to the car. When I got in, I locked the doors and sat still for a minute, breathing heavily. I had this sick feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I turned the key, but nothing happened. Not even a click. I tried again. Still nothing. I popped the hood and got out, but when I looked at the engine, I froze. Someone had pulled out all the wires from the battery and left them lying neatly across the air filter. I hadn't looked under the hood since I arrived, and no animal would have done something that precise. That's when I knew I wasn't alone out there. I ran back to the cabin and bolted the door shut. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. There was no way to call for help. No way to walk out. Not with the trail being 15 miles of forest and no guarantee that whoever did this wasn't waiting out there. I spent the rest of the day sitting at the table watching the windows. Every now and then I thought I saw that flash of yellow again, just at the edge of the woods, just for a second, then gone. Once I saw a figure, definitely a person, standing about 40 yards away, mostly hidden by trees. He was facing the cabin. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see his shape, tall and still, just staring. He didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I looked away to grab the hatchet from near the stove, and when I looked back, he was gone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire low and sat with my back to the wall, holding the hatchet. Every sound outside made my heart stop. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch again. Slow, scraping. They stopped at the door. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then I heard the doorknob turn. It rattled softly, once, then again, then nothing. By morning, I had made a plan. I would take the long trail out by foot. I had a compass, a small pack, and enough water to last a day. I just had to make it to the ranger station near the base of the mountain, maybe 20 miles if I cut straight through. Before I left, I checked the car again. The hood was closed now. When I opened it, the wires were still pulled, but the battery was missing completely. Whoever was out there had come back and taken it. I slung my bag over my shoulder and stepped off the porch with the hatchet in one hand. I moved fast and kept looking back. The forest felt alive, but not in a good way, like it was holding its breath. About 5 miles in, I saw something hanging from a tree, another strip of yellow cloth, and beneath it, a pile of crushed cigarette butts, still fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching the trail. I turned off the path and started bushwhacking through dense brush. It was slower, harder, but I felt like I had no choice. I had to throw off whoever might be following me. I kept moving for hours. I didn't stop, didn't eat, just drank a little water and pressed forward. Every now and then I'd hear a noise behind me. A branch snap, a footstep, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the edge of a fire road near dusk, my legs were shaking. My boots were soaked. I had blisters on both heels. But I saw a sign nailed to a post up ahead, one of those old wooden ones pointing to a ranger station. I almost cried. I made it there right before sunset. The station was locked, but there was an emergency radio mounted outside. I called in, gave my name, and waited. It took 2 hours, but a ranger arrived in a truck and drove me back to town. I didn't tell him everything, just that someone had messed with my car and I got spooked. He wrote it down, nodded slowly, and said something about people living off the grid in those woods. People who don't want to be found. When I got back home, I called the owner of the cabin and told him what happened. He said he'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. I decided to stay in a remote cabin deep in the northern mountains for 3 weeks to clear my head. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. That was part of the reason I picked the place. I'd found it on a forum where people exchanged off-grid spots, and one guy had posted GPS coordinates to a cabin he claimed was abandoned but usable. No phone signal, no power lines, just a structure with a roof, walls, and a door that locked. The hike took me most of a day. I started early from a trailhead in a logging area. The first few hours were easy, mostly flat and dry, but as the trail climbed and narrowed, snow started showing up in patches. I'd expected cold, but not this much snow. By the time I got to the top of the ridge where the GPS marker was, the ground was frozen solid. My boots crunched with every step. I found the cabin around 4 in the afternoon. It looked exactly how I expected it would. A one-room log box with a slanted metal roof, one window on each side, and a small porch that was barely holding together. It sat in a shallow clearing, ringed with thick pines. The trees were heavy with snow and barely moved in the wind. I remember standing there for a while, just staring at it. It looked worn but sturdy. No obvious holes in the roof, no sagging walls, no broken glass. Inside, it was cold and smelled of wood and dust. There was a cot in one corner, a small table made from rough-cut boards, and a rusted-out stove in the middle. There were a few shelves nailed to the walls, but they were empty except for some rusted tin cans and a stack of old firewood. I spent the next couple hours sweeping and unpacking. I had my own gear, camp stove, sleeping bag, food, water purifier. I knew what I was doing. I'd spent time alone in the woods before. Not in winter, but I thought I could handle it. I didn't see any signs that anyone had been there recently. The door had a thick metal latch and it closed tight. I tested it from the inside and out. The window panes were dirty but solid. I taped up the one with a crack using duct tape just to be sure. I even checked around the outside of the cabin before dark. No footprints, no signs of animals. That first night was quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when you're far from everything. The cold made the walls groan a little, and wind pushed against the roof now and then, but it felt safe. I made tea on my stove and sat on the cot reading a paperback until I fell asleep. The next morning was colder. I stepped outside and saw that it had snowed a few inches overnight. There were no tracks in the snow, just a clean white layer covering the porch and the surrounding ground. I walked around the cabin again just to look. Everything seemed normal. I spent the day hiking a few hundred meters in every direction, marking trees with orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. I wanted to get familiar with the area. The trees were dense, and the sky was gray all day. Felt like snow might fall again. By the third day, the snow had piled up another half-foot, and I started keeping a fire going inside most of the day. I'd found a small axe behind the cabin, rusted but usable, and I spent a good chunk of the day chopping kindling. I knew I'd need it if the temperature dropped more. It was the 5th night that I noticed something strange. It wasn't anything loud or dramatic, just a shape. I woke up around 2 in the morning to pee. I opened the door to step outside, and as I was finishing, I looked out past the tree line and saw a shape standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was a tree, but it wasn't. It was too slim, too upright, and it didn't move. It was just standing there. I stood there too, frozen, trying to convince myself it was nothing. My breath fogged in the air. My fingers burned from the cold. Then it moved, just a small shift, like someone adjusting their weight. It didn't walk toward me or wave or call out, just a tiny lean to the left. That was enough. I stepped back into the cabin and shut the door. I locked it. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked out there. I followed the line from where I'd been standing to the trees. I saw no tracks, but the snow was crusted, and it was possible someone could have walked there earlier and the snow froze over. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe my eyes played tricks on me in the dark. I was tired. That made sense. But then, that night, I heard movement outside. Not wind, not snow falling from branches. Real movement. Steady, deliberate footsteps on snow. I sat up in the cot, holding my small flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. I didn't want to turn the light on. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. I just sat there, listening. The steps came up the side of the cabin, stopped, then moved again toward the front porch. There was a long pause, then a creak. The porch. Something stepped on the porch. I stayed still. I didn't breathe. I waited to hear a knock or a voice, but nothing came, just silence. The footsteps didn't walk away. They just stopped. When the sun came up, I opened the door. There were footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human-sized, not child-sized either. They led from the trees to the porch, stopped at the door, and then veered around the side of the cabin. I followed them. They didn't lead anywhere. They just ended, like the person had stopped walking and disappeared. I felt sick. I didn't eat that day. I just stayed inside with the axe and the knife and my flashlight, watching the windows. I kept checking the latch on the door. I pushed the table against it that night. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a plan to leave. I packed my bag, stripped everything down to essentials, and marked my map. The trail was nearly snowed in, but I knew I could get out if I left early and didn't stop. It would be a long hike, maybe 9 hours, but I felt like I couldn't stay there any longer. Just before I was about to go, I checked my GPS. No signal. It had been working in offline mode all week, but now it wouldn't turn on. I tried my phone too. Dead. I knew both were charged. I'd been using the solar panel every day to keep them topped off, but they were dead. Both of them. I almost left anyway. I opened the door with my pack on, stepped onto the porch, and stopped. There were footprints again, but these ones were different. They were mine. They led from the door, out into the woods, and then came back. Like I had sleepwalked, but I hadn't. I hadn't left the cabin all night. I was sure of it. Unless I had. Unless someone else wore my boots. That thought almost broke me. I stepped back inside and slammed the door. I stripped my boots off and checked them. They were dry, cold but dry. The prints were fresh. Sometime that night, someone had walked out and back wearing my boots, or they'd made exact copies of my footprints. That night, I didn't turn off the light. I didn't lie down. I just sat in the corner with the axe and flashlight, waiting. At around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. The creak of the porch. The sound of something sliding against the door. Then I saw a shadow pass in front of the window. It was thin, human, standing still, and then it ducked out of sight. The next morning, I found something tied to the doorknob with twine. A piece of cloth. One of my socks. It had a small rip on the toe that I remembered. I had packed 3 pairs. I checked my bag. 1 pair was missing. I hadn't taken it out. I know that. I didn't leave that day, or the next. Snowed again. Deep, thick snow. If I left now, I could freeze out there, or get lost. So I stayed. Each night, the noises got louder. I started hearing scratches on the walls, scraping sounds, the sound of something being dragged around the outside. I nailed boards over the window using the old shelf wood. I blocked the chimney. I stopped using the stove. I ate cold food from cans and barely moved. I think I lost track of the days. Then one night, I woke up and the door was open, wide open. The cold wind blew snow into the room, and I was still lying on the cot, wrapped in my bag. The table was still pushed against the door. There were prints leading inside, bare feet. They stopped just a few feet into the room. Then they turned around and left. That was the last night I spent there. I left at dawn. I didn't care how cold it was or how much snow had fallen. I left my pack behind and just took my knife and water bottle. I walked without stopping for hours. I didn't use the trail. I just moved downhill, crashing through trees, sliding through drifts. My hands bled. My lips cracked. I thought I was gonna die out there, but I didn't. I found a snowmobile trail late in the afternoon and followed it. I came out near a ranger station. They asked me questions. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd gotten lost, that I'd stayed in an old cabin. They didn't press. When I got home, I had my friend drive me to my place and I slept for 2 days. I didn't dream. I didn't even really sleep. I just lay in bed, eyes closed, heart still pounding like it was waiting for something. It's been 6 months. I haven't gone back to the woods. I still check my door twice every night before bed. I still keep I took time off from work in early October to escape everything. I had been dealing with months of back-to-back meetings, reports, and sitting in front of a glowing monitor, just watching emails pile up. My mind felt clogged, like something inside me was swelling from stress. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted something where no one could reach me. I picked a remote cabin deep in northern Montana. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden place about 2 miles from the closest gravel road. It sat beside a narrow stream that curved around the trees like a silver snake. I found it on a website listing remote rentals. It had no Wi-Fi, no signal, no modern distractions. Just wood walls, a propane heater, and an outhouse about 30 feet behind the back porch. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no phones, just woods, fresh air, and time to clear my head. The hike in was quiet. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. My backpack was heavy with supplies. I brought canned food, water filters, a flare gun, and a thick sleeping bag. I planned to stay for 10 days. I kept my phone on me, even though I knew it wouldn't work. It just felt strange not to have it. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Small, dark brown, and nestled between tall trees. The stream behind it made a steady sound like someone quietly sweeping gravel. I unpacked and settled in. For the first 2 days, it was perfect. I spent most of my time sitting on the porch, reading, or taking short hikes into the woods around the cabin. I saw deer once, just before sunrise. I cooked simple meals on a camp stove, and the silence felt healing. I was finally away from all of it, no traffic, no noise, no pressure, just space to breathe. On the 3rd day, I noticed something strange. I was hiking downstream from the cabin, following the curve of the water. The sun was out, and the trees let beams of light break through like stage lights. About 1.5 miles away from the cabin, I came to a clearing. There was a flat area near the stream where the water widened slightly before narrowing again. That's when I saw it. Something pale on the other side of the stream, maybe 20 feet from the water. It looked like a plastic bag at first. I crossed over a fallen log to get a better look. It was a shirt, a white t-shirt, dirty with reddish smudges on it. It was lying flat like it had been dropped or taken off in a hurry. That alone didn't mean anything. But about 10 feet away, I saw something else. Shoe prints in the mud. Big ones, larger than mine. They looked fresh. There were no hiking trails near here. This wasn't public land with signs or markers. As far as I knew, the cabin I rented was the only structure for miles in any direction. I checked the booking website again when I got back, and it confirmed that. The land was private and owned by a local company that managed remote cabins. So who was out here? I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was someone who got lost or someone who had camped illegally. That happens. I didn't hear anything that night except the stream and the occasional crack of a branch. The next morning, I walked the same path, but I took a left off the usual route and went further into the trees, following the water again. About an hour in, I came across something else. A boot. It was half buried in mud near a rock, almost like someone had tried to hide it. It was old, worn, but the laces had been cleanly cut. Next to it was something that chilled me completely. Half of a protein bar still in the wrapper, bitten once. That wasn't old. That was recent, like maybe hours old. My mouth felt dry. I scanned the trees in every direction, slowly turning in place. I listened hard. Nothing, just wind and the stream. I crouched down and picked up the wrapper. It didn't smell rotten. That meant it hadn't been sitting there long at all. I felt my heartbeat speed up. There was someone else out here, someone close. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I turned around and started heading back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small sounds. Branches shifting, rustling in the leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just the normal sounds of the forest. But something felt different now. The calmness was gone. My stomach felt like it had a weight in it, like I had swallowed a rock. On the 5th day, I stayed near the cabin. I kept the door locked and only went out to use the outhouse. I kept checking the tree line. I looked at the stream again and again, watching for movement. That's when I saw something that made me sit down slowly and stay completely still. There was a man on the other side of the stream. He was maybe 50 yards away, standing half behind a tree, just enough that I could barely make out his shoulder and part of his head. He wasn't walking, just standing, watching. He wasn't moving. I stared for maybe 2 minutes, not blinking. My hands were sweaty. I slowly lowered myself behind the porch railing and waited. I peeked up again after another minute. He was gone. I didn't go back out that day. That night, I kept a flashlight near my sleeping bag. I stayed fully clothed in case I had to run. I didn't sleep more than an hour, maybe 2. The next morning, I made the decision to cut the trip short. I packed everything quickly. It was still early, and the sky was cloudy. I hiked back to the gravel road. But when I reached the road, I noticed something that turned my spine to ice. There were tire tracks. That shouldn't have been possible. The only person allowed to drive up that road was the property manager, and I hadn't seen or heard a car all week. These tracks were fresh, not dusty like older ones. The ground was slightly damp, and I could see how the rubber had pressed into it cleanly. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped about a quarter-mile down, then turned around. Whoever had come in didn't stay. They turned around and left. I waited there at the edge of the road, trying to decide what to do. There was no cell signal. I could hike out to a ranger station, but that was another 6 miles over rough ground. I felt torn between 2 dangers: stay alone in the woods where someone was possibly watching me, or risk walking out in the open where I could be followed. I went back to the cabin. I didn't unpack anything. I just locked the door, loaded the flare gun, and kept my boots on. That night, something happened. It was past midnight. I was still wide awake. I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Outside. On the porch. Slow, steady. Creaking wood. I held my breath. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then I heard the soft sound of someone trying the doorknob. Slow, gentle, like they were testing it. Then again. And again. Then nothing. For almost an hour. I didn't hear them walk away. Eventually, I fell asleep just from pure exhaustion. When I woke up, it was light outside. I crept to the door and opened it slowly. No one was there, but something had changed. There were scratches on the door frame. Thin, shallow scratches, like someone had run a knife or a sharp rock along the wood. I snapped. I packed everything again as fast as I could. I left the cabin and hiked the entire way to the ranger station, pushing myself without stopping. When I arrived, I found someone and told them everything. They took me seriously. A local sheriff came out and checked the cabin area. They found the shirt, the boot, and the protein bar. They also found signs that someone had been camping further down the stream, hidden behind a thick patch of trees. There was a tarp, some trash, and a pile of stripped wires. A knife, a pair of binoculars. They said it looked like someone had been squatting out there, possibly watching the area, possibly watching me. But there was no one there when they arrived. They never found the man. I left Montana that same day and never went back. I think about that cabin often. I think about how quiet it was, how perfect it seemed at first, and then how quickly it all changed. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know this: he wasn't lost. He wasn't camping. He was watching, and he was waiting, and I will never go that deep into the woods again. I was tired of my life in the city. I didn't hate it, but everything felt like it was repeating. I was waking up every morning to the same noise outside, the same traffic, the same emails, the same walls. I started to feel this pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away. I wasn't sleeping properly. Even when I had time off, I stayed home and wasted it. I told myself I needed to break that routine before it got worse. So I thought of getting away for a few days, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from all the noise. I didn't want to fly anywhere or do anything expensive. I just wanted to be alone and breathe for a while. I started looking for cabins to rent. I didn't want anything fancy, just something out in the woods. After looking for a couple of hours, I found this listing. It was deep in a forested area, a few hours' drive from the city. No neighbors, no cell signal, no Wi-Fi. Exactly what I wanted. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, a shower with water from a well, and a generator for electricity. No TV, no internet. Just trees, birds, and quiet. The pictures looked old, like they were taken with a cheap camera, but the cabin seemed clean and well-built. It had a small front porch, a fire pit, a basic kitchen, and a single bedroom. The listing had a strange feeling to it, but I ignored that. I figured the guy who posted it wasn't very good at marketing. The price was cheap. That should have made me more careful, but I saw it as a lucky find. I booked it for 4 nights. I packed my car with food, water, a flashlight, some extra clothes, a knife, some tools, and a paperback book. I left early in the morning and drove for hours. The roads got smaller and rougher the deeper I went into the forest. Eventually, I had to drive on a dirt path full of ruts and branches. I saw fewer signs of people. No cars, no houses, no fences. Just trees. The GPS stopped working at some point, but I had written down directions from the listing. When I reached the cabin, it was just like in the pictures. Maybe a little older. The wooden steps creaked. The windows were dusty, but everything looked fine. The trees around it were thick, and the shadows from the branches made the place feel colder than it was. I turned off the car and stepped out. The silence hit me hard. No city sounds, no engines, no voices. Just the wind moving through leaves and the distant sound of birds. Felt good. I thought I had made the right choice. I unlocked the cabin with the key I had gotten in the mail. The door stuck a little but opened. Inside was small but clean. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a stove, some shelves, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and bathroom. I walked through slowly, checking things. Everything was basic. A few old tools hung on the wall. A lantern, a fire extinguisher, a steel pot. There was no mirror in the bathroom, which I thought was strange, but I didn't think much of it. After unloading my stuff, I started a small fire in the wood stove. The smell of smoke filled the air, mixing with the scent of pine and old wood. I sat down in one of the chairs and just listened. I could feel my heart slow down. For the first time in months, I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel like I needed to check anything. I stayed there for hours, staring out the window, watching the trees move. That night, I ate some canned food, drank some water, and read my book for a while. When the fire burned down low, I went to bed. The mattress was thin, but I didn't mind. The silence was deep. I didn't even hear bugs. That struck me as a little odd, but I figured it was too cold for them. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up with a clear head. I made instant coffee on the stove and stood outside drinking it. I didn't see any paths or trails nearby, just thick forest in every direction. I walked around a bit but stayed close. I didn't want to get lost. After breakfast, I chopped a bit of wood, cleaned up the kitchen, and read some more. It was the kind of peaceful day I had hoped for. In the afternoon, I noticed something that made me pause. There were marks on the trees behind the cabin, not scratches from animals. These looked like cuts made by a knife or axe, small notches. I counted 7 of them, each on a different tree. They formed a rough line leading away from the cabin into the woods. I wondered if it was some kind of trail marker or maybe someone's property boundary. I followed them a little way but turned back after a few minutes. The forest got denser, and I didn't want to risk getting turned around. That night, I went to bed after reading for a while again. I left the lantern on low and the fire burning gently. At some point, I woke up to a faint noise. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind or animals. It was this low, rhythmic thumping. It didn't sound like footsteps exactly, but it wasn't mechanical either. I listened for a long time. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a tree branch hitting something, or maybe a woodpecker, but I couldn't fall back asleep for a while. The next day, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. One of the notched trees I saw yesterday now had a fresh mark next to the old one. A clean cut, newer than the rest. I was sure it hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time. I walked back to the cabin and checked the area. Nothing was missing, but I had a bad feeling now. I started thinking about how alone I really was. No phone signal, no nearby houses. Nobody would hear me scream out here. That evening, I decided to take no chances. I locked the door from the inside, even though I had left it unlocked the night before. I pulled a chair in front of the door and kept my knife within reach. I didn't sleep much. The forest was too quiet again. Not even wind. Around midnight, I heard the thumping again. It was slower this time. Then I heard something else. A soft sound like fingers brushing wood came from the front porch. I froze in bed. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I didn't even breathe right. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. The morning light made everything feel normal again, but I didn't trust it. I went outside and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. I checked the door, the windows, the generator, even the fire pit. Everything was untouched, but I still had this tight feeling in my stomach, like someone had been watching me all night. I planned to leave the next morning. I thought I could make it through one more night. I stayed inside that day. I read, kept the fire going, and tried not to let my thoughts spiral. I didn't go near the marked trees. I cooked a real meal that night using some rice and canned beans. I tried to act normal, but the quiet was heavier now. Felt like something was waiting for me to relax. That night, it got worse. I had locked everything and made sure nothing could open easily. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud bang. Came from the back of the cabin. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the knife. I stood near the window trying to listen. I didn't hear footsteps, just one more bang, then silence. I waited. I didn't sleep again. I stayed up with the lantern on, sitting in the chair with the knife in my hand. My breathing was shallow. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. When the sun came up, I didn't waste time. I packed everything fast. I loaded the car in 10 minutes. As I was locking the cabin, I walked around one last time. Behind the cabin, near where I heard the bang, I found something that made my legs shake. Someone had left a pile of small rocks in the shape of a spiral. Not random, deliberate. The rocks were clean. Someone had placed them during the night. I didn't touch them. I got in the car and started driving. As I pulled away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw a person standing between the trees. Not moving, just standing. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove all the way back to the city in one stretch, only stopping once for gas. I got home that night and locked every door. I didn't tell anyone at first. I couldn't explain it. There was no proof, no pictures, no footprints, just my memory of the spiral, the noises, and those fresh marks on the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me. Something that watched and waited and never showed itself completely. I don't know what it wanted. Maybe it just wanted me gone. Or maybe it was playing a game I didn't understand. A week later, I looked up the listing again. It was gone. The website said the post had been removed. I searched for the address. Nothing came up. No records. I couldn't even find the road I took on any map. It was like the whole thing had been scrubbed clean. I started thinking maybe the cabin was never meant to be rented. Maybe someone had put the listing up just to lure people out there. Or maybe the cabin had been abandoned long ago, and someone else was using it now. I don't know. I never went back. I never will. The city doesn't seem so bad anymore. I keep my windows closed at night, and I don't go anywhere without telling someone. I don't care if that makes me paranoid. Something was out there, something real, and it's started when I needed to get away for a while. Work had been grinding me down. The noise, the people, the same screens day after day. I was always tired, always irritated, and I'd started snapping at people who didn't deserve it. I knew I needed space. Real space, not a hotel, not a resort. Just trees, sky, and quiet. I found a small off-grid cabin listed on a site that catered to people looking to disconnect. It was way up north, tucked into a forest that bordered a wildlife reserve. The pictures showed a basic one-room wooden cabin, a generator, a wood stove, and a small shed behind it. No Wi-Fi, no signal. That was perfect. The listing said it was about a 15-minute walk from where you parked to where the cabin stood. That also sounded good. I liked the idea of it being a little hard to reach. I packed enough food for a week, a solar battery for essentials, a .22 rifle just in case I ran into something dangerous, and some books. No laptop, no phone. I brought paper maps and a GPS just in case, but I didn't plan to leave the area much. The drive was long. I passed the last gas station about 45 minutes before I turned off onto a narrow gravel road with faded markings and soft edges. It snaked through thick pine forests that seemed darker than they should have been, even in daylight. The trees here weren't like the ones near the city. They were taller, older, with tangled branches and thick, almost black bark. I finally reached the small clearing where the listing said I could park. It wasn't even a proper lot, just a spot where the ground was a little more level and the grass was flattened down. I cut the engine and sat for a second. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in suburbs at night. This was thick quiet. I couldn't hear cars, planes, or people. Just trees creaking in the wind and the occasional call of a bird I didn't recognize. I grabbed my pack and my gear, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail to the cabin wasn't obvious at first, but I followed the instructions from the listing and found a faint footpath between two leaning birches. The ground was soft but dry. The air smelled clean, like pine needles and wet dirt. I kept walking, my boots crunching on gravel and snapping thin twigs underfoot. It took me closer to 30 minutes to get there, probably because I kept stopping to get my bearings. The forest felt thick and a bit disorienting, but eventually, I saw the shape of the cabin through the trees. It was just like the photos. Weathered wood, green roof, small front porch with a single old chair. The windows were small and had shutters nailed open. I dropped my stuff on the porch, unlocked the heavy door, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a cot, a table, 2 chairs, some shelves with old pans, and a propane stove. A fire extinguisher hung near the door. The wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of chopped logs beside it. There were scratch marks on the floor around the stove like someone had dragged the logs around a lot. I didn't think much of it. Behind the cabin was a shed and a composting toilet about 30 feet out into the trees. I checked everything, unloaded my supplies, and settled in. That first night was peaceful. I cooked, read by lantern light, and slept early. It was the second day when things started to feel off. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a smell outside the cabin. It wasn't strong, but it was there, kind of sour and metallic, like meat left out too long. I checked around the cabin and figured maybe an animal had died nearby. I didn't see anything, though. The wind wasn't blowing hard, so the smell faded in and out. I ignored it. Later that evening, I went to chop more wood behind the shed. That's when I noticed something strange. A pile of broken branches in the tree line, about 50 feet from the shed. They looked freshly snapped, not fallen naturally. It wasn't stormy, and there was no reason for branches that thick to just fall. I walked closer, just enough to see. Something had definitely moved through there recently. The underbrush was disturbed, and the ground had deep marks, like something heavy had pressed down. Could have been a moose or a bear, but there were no tracks, just crushed plants and flattened spots. I backed off. I wasn't scared exactly, not yet, but I was alert. I made sure the door was locked that night, even though there wasn't really anyone around for miles. At about 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. A soft, dragging noise from outside, like something being pulled across the porch. Then it stopped. I lay still, listening hard. Nothing. I got up quietly, took the rifle, and peeked out the front window. Nothing was there. The porch was empty. I opened the door and stepped out slowly. I didn't see anything around the cabin, but I walked out to the edge of the clearing and aimed my flashlight toward the tree line. That's when I saw him. A man, standing just past the edge of the trees, about 30 feet out. Still, not moving. No light. I could only see his shape because my flashlight was catching the edges of his form. He was tall, too tall to be average, wearing dark clothing, no visible bag or gear, just standing there half in shadow. My chest tightened, and I slowly backed up toward the cabin without taking the light off him. But he didn't move. He just stood there. I got inside and locked the door again. I stayed up the rest of the night. He never came closer, never made a sound, but I didn't see him walk away either. When daylight came, I checked again. He was gone. The next day, I hiked out to the truck. I needed to get to a town or something. When I reached the spot, my truck was there, but the back window had been smashed. Nothing was taken. My spare fuel tank had been dumped out onto the dirt, and a long, deep scratch had been carved into the driver's side door, almost like someone had used a metal tool to scrape it. I don't know why, but the way the scratch curved, it felt deliberate, like a message. I drove to the nearest ranger station, about an hour and a half away. I explained what I saw, but they looked at me like I was overreacting. They took my report, told me there were no known hikers or squatters in that area. I asked about illegal hunting or maybe a lost camper. They said it was possible, but unlikely. The area didn't get many people. I could tell they weren't going to do much. I debated going home right then, but something in me didn't want to leave. I felt like if I left without understanding what was going on, it would haunt me worse. So I went back. The next night was quiet. The smell returned briefly, stronger this time, and I swear I saw movement deep in the woods just before dusk, like a shadow slipping between the trees. I spent most of that day watching the forest. I didn't read. I didn't cook. I just watched. That's when I realized something else. The birds weren't singing anymore. On the first day, there were bird calls, squirrel sounds, bugs buzzing. Now it was just nothing. The forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel right. Not natural. At midnight, I heard the dragging again. This time, it circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate scraping along the wall. I held my breath, rifle in my lap, but I didn't go out. When morning came, I checked the ground. There were marks in the dirt, long, shallow trails like something had been pulled in a circle. They started and stopped randomly, never leading away. Just a loop. I checked my gear. Nothing stolen, but one thing was missing, my hand axe. It had been leaning against the woodpile. It was just gone. I looked all over for it, but gave up. I started keeping the rifle next to me at all times. The next day, I walked the area in a wide circle, about half a mile in all directions. I wanted to find any clue about who this person was. I found another disturbed spot in the woods, broken branches. A pile of rocks stacked in a strange, uneven triangle. I kicked it over. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't have touched it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps. Actual footsteps. Slow, heavy, and deliberate. They moved around the cabin once, then stopped behind the shed. I waited, listening so hard I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. When I finally opened the door, there was no one there. But on the shed wall, scratched into the wood, were 3 lines. 3. That was it. Just 3 tall scratch marks, deep and uneven, like they'd been carved with my missing axe. I started packing that day. I didn't even care anymore about who it was or what they wanted. I just wanted out. The forest didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like something alive, watching, and waiting. Before I left, I took one last look around. I walked back to the tree line where I'd seen the man. I didn't see him this time, but I found something worse. My axe. It was driven into a tree, blade first, at shoulder height. The handle had been wrapped in deer sinew or something like it, and nailed into the bark. There were more marks around it, like someone had carved small symbols, maybe 5 or 6, none of them familiar. I left it there. I walked back to the truck, drove for hours without stopping, and didn't look back. When I got home, I tried reporting it again, but they said no crimes had been